Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever it is that you're joining us from. And welcome to today's international webinar on the world's tectonic geopolitical changes and their implications. A nice small agenda there. I am Joseph Gerson with the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. As we begin, I want to thank Mariana Fernandez, who is at our Zoom controls, and our co-sponsors, Peace Action New York State, Maine Peace Action, the International Peace Bureau, and Brooklyn for Peace. For those who are not familiar with the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, let me briefly say that we are for peace, justice, and we work for peace, justice, and environmental sustainability on the basis of the recognition that security cannot be achieved against a nation's rival, but only with it, via what is not infrequently challenging but essential diplomacy. That is how the Cold War was brought to an end, even before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and is more essential today than ever, domestically as well as internationally. A lot has happened in the 2 years since the Biden administration proclaimed in its national security strategy that the post-Cold War era is over, and that the competition to shape what follows was well underway. That was before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, before Putin and Xi announced their partnership with no limits, before last week's summit in Beijing, and their deepening economic, diplomatic, and military integrations. That was before Hamas's October 7th massive massacre and Israel's racist and genocidal war, which is being fought with a siege that denies innocent Gazans food, water, and fuel, and medical supplies, as well as with 2,000-pound bombs being dropped on hospitals and homes and the targeting of aid workers. The U.S. has been deeply complicit from its continuing support of offensive weapons, continuing supply of offensive weapons, and its support for Netanyahu, and the assaults on freedoms of speech and assembly and inquiry in universities and elsewhere here across the United States. Beyond the greatest powers, the global South's growing influence has been marked by many nations refusing to take sides in the Ukraine war, by the BRICS de-dollarization campaign, and by South Africa charging Israel with genocide in the International Court of Justice. The Biden strategy also came before the people of the world suffered the hottest year in 2 millennia, before Annie Jacobson illuminated the unimaginable in her book, Nuclear War, a Scenario, and before polls showed that Donald Trump in the lead in swing states, while Hell's Angels demonstrated support for him, would-be dictator, in a criminal courtroom. These and other tectonic changes are playing out before our eyes. They threaten our existence and will affect our children's and our grandchildren's lives for decades to come. We need to understand these changes and to adjust our strategies and actions if we are to stanch and reverse the existential threats, excuse me, and contribute to greater justice and peace with common security diplomacy. We are privileged to have 3 uniquely knowledgeable and committed experts to help us understand these tectonic changes and to suggest changes and actions that we should be taking. It's really a treat to have them all with us and to be learning from them. Before I introduce them, first a few words about our format and logistics. We will begin with 2 rounds of questions. The first to elicit our panelists' understandings of how the world is changing, and then second to answer the question of what then must be done. Their initial presentations will be followed by a brief period in which they can ask each other for clarifications, and then we'll turn to the question and answer period. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom and center of your screen. I will do my best to keep track of them and to ask as many of them as time allows. I do need to appeal to you, please, not to fill the Q&A function with chat-like comments. That will only make it more difficult and challenging for me to see and raise your questions. I should also add that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll send the link to everyone who has registered. Okay, let me then turn to our speakers in the order that they'll be speaking. Richard Falk is Emeritus Professor of International Law at Princeton University, the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Palestine, in the Palestinian territories, and the author of a mere 20 books. The first of his books that I read, dare I say it, 50 years ago, was Regional Politics and World Order. So you can see that he's been preparing for today's webinar for many years. More recently, Richard published Global Governance and International Cooperation, Managing Global Catastrophic Risks in the 21st Century. Arunata Chinoy Anu is adjunct professor at the Jindal Global University in Haryana in India and associate fellow at the Transnational Institute in the Netherlands. She retired as dean and professor of international relations with Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Anu is an engaged scholar who has written numerous books, including Reemerging Russia and Human Security. She's also a member of the Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, a consultant with focus on Global South and the Asia and of the Asia European Forum. I'm privileged to be working with her on a resource about the urgent need for common security in the Asia Pacific. Michael Clare is Emeritus Professor of the Five Colleges Peace and World Security Program. He's defense correspondent for The Nation magazine, a member of the board of directors of the Arms Control Association, a contributor to many publications, and an author whose numerous books include All Hell Breaking Loose, Blood and Oil, and Rising Powers, Shrinking Planet. In recent years, I've been privileged to work with Michael in our joint project Committee for a Sane U.S.-China Policy. Michael has just returned from an important security conference in Vienna, where his talk focused on the increasing high-tech and very dangerous arms race. So with that, I'm happy to be able to turn the floor over to Richard, and I will be at 8 minutes, I'm sorry to say, be giving a heads up that we need to wrap up for the first round. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, and it's a great pleasure and challenge to be with such a distinguished and congenial panel.
Just to say, Mariana, we need to get Richard's picture on screen. I've got Michael.
Should I proceed?
I think continue. We'll figure out the technology here.
Okay, good. My sense of the present moment is less in accord with the idea that the post-Cold War world is over and finished. I interpret the way in which the U.S. responded to the Ukraine war as indicative of an effort to continue its domination of the management of global security. And in that sense, it was less interested in what happened to Ukraine and more interested in what happens to Russia. And it is, in a way, conducting the Ukraine war so as to sacrifice Ukraine for the sake of trying to inflict a geopolitical defeat upon Russia. And this idea of doing something to maintain the geopolitical alignment that emerged after the Soviet collapse created a unique situation in world history where the domination of this management of global security and power, which, contrary to Antony Blinken's talk of a rules-governed world, and contrary to the ideas that this managerial role was entrusted to the UN and to international law, it's my view that the whole state-centric world order that is usually connected with the Peace of Westphalia back in 1648 was the beginning of a kind of Western hegemonic control of the entire political life of the planet. And it rose to its exploitative peak during the colonial era. And the challenge for the global West has been how to maintain that managerial dominance in light of the collapse of colonialism. So the one has these two developments, the collapse of colonialism and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the US in particular tried to fill the geopolitical vacuum that arose from that collapse and to create a global security context in which only the US could use forcible power outside its borders and maintain a kind, what I've previously called a Monroe Doctrine for the world, in which no other state, including the geopolitical aspirants, Russia and China, can act outside their borders coercively. And this leads me to think that we're not in a period that is subsequent to the post-Cold War world. We're in a period that more closely resembles Gramsci's idea about terrible things happening in the transition from one type of order to another, where he talks about morbid symptoms coming to the surface in this period of interregnum. And the consequence of that endeavor is a overinvestment in military power and overconfidence in the agency of military superiority in this post-colonial world. And this, of course, parallels the thinking of Paul Kennedy and others about the patterns of decline of geopolitically dominant political actors or empires. They overreach and then they employ desperate methods to obscure that pattern with terrible domestic backlash. And we now have a presidential election emerging in which on one side is an almost self-proclaiming fascist, and on the other side, a self-proclaiming warmonger. And that's the choice given to the American people, and in a sense, is imposed on the rest of the world. And so one characteristic of this period, which is different than the Cold War, is what this national security strategy document called the second great challenge. The first is competition among geopolitical actors. The second is this inability to manage transnational problems like climate change and uh, energy allocations and transitions and food insecurity, a series of problems that are identified that require cooperative problem solving and can't be handled through traditional conflictual patterns. And for that reason, in this document, which I think gives a lot of insight into the way in which the U.S. is trying to reconfigure the post-Cold War world, there's a big emphasis on cooperative problem solving and traditional modes of addressing challenges to distributions of power.
Richard, I hate to do this, but I need you to wrap up. Sorry.
No, I think I more or less said what I had to say.
Well, I hate having to be the censor for Richard Falk, but there we are. We'll come back. And thank you, Richard, for kind of if you will, chastising me a little bit in terms of the framing. I fully agree with your analysis. Anu, you're on. You're muted.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this very distinguished panel. Indeed, it is a great honor and privilege for me to be here. And I must say, I agree with everything that Richard has just said. And because not only because we've, in India and many other places in the global South, Richard has been a de facto professor who we have learned from his books. And interestingly, what Richard said resonates not just with the academic and civil community, I think, in the global South, but a lot of states actually have a similar framework if you actually see their policies. So, of course, I will focus on these tectonic geopolitical changes, which are stemming from different sources, but I will focus on the global South and specifically on very much on Asia. Now, I think the global South, in all these rising hegemons, etc., has never been hegemonic and has no single organization, no policy-making forum or a collective security structure. But these very diverse countries are at very different stages of uneven development, but in the international sphere, they remain, most of them remain non-aligned, or they practice neutrality and are part of the non-aligned movement. So what happened was that during the unipolar phase with the heightened US exceptionalism, which Richard just mentioned, and globalization, there were some major changes in the global South when some countries became beneficiaries of this globalization policies. China being the most significant, but also India, South Africa, and Brazil. And that is why they were clubbed as the emerging economies. And they were also, these countries also had significant regional power. Some called them quasi-hegemons, but in any case, they exercised some regional power. Now, all these countries have repeatedly been asking for some share in international decision-making bodies like the IMF, World Bank, Security Council, but they have remained excluded. And this propelled them into making the BRICS in 2009. And similarly, there were other such powers in Southeast Asia. They were called the Asian Tigers. And now BRICS has expanded to include 4 more: Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Ethiopia, and many others, including these ASEAN countries, want to join. Now, simultaneously, this period, as everyone knows, saw the stabilization of Russia under Putin. But now, it would be a fallacy to see BRICS as an alternative economic system. It is not. It is only a sub-option of global capitalism, but the combined purchasing power of these BRICS countries or of these global South countries has actually grown larger than that of the G7. So the core of BRICS is really to promote multilateral trading, leveraging trade between themselves and globally, to advance reforms in the international financial institutions so they have greater voice. But very importantly, in their very first meeting in 2009 and repeated in almost every meeting is what I would say, what the BRICS repeatedly say, and I quote, they say that we underline our support for a more democratic and just multipolar world order based on the rule of international law, equality, and mutual respect. So you can see that these countries of the global South, who are the leading members in BRICS, they not only see the international system as being multipolar currently, but they're actively engaged in constructing it. So they're putting in a lot of effort for this multipolar system, which was, of course, first advanced by Russia and China, but now much of the global South believes in it. Now they see multipolarity as a diversification of power in the international system, where, of course, the distribution of power is asymmetric, and some poles will and do dominate, but where countries with lesser power can also exert influence and choice. And they also see multipolarity as a kind of a regionalization of power, like a new federal confederal system of regionalization of power. Now, most of the global South, these countries believe that this asymmetric multipolarity gives them geopolitical and geoeconomic advantages and strategic autonomy. So they would have the choice within these poles, even if these are not alternates. And this they bolster with non-alignment or neutrality because it serves their national sovereignty and consensus building. And you can see, for example, ASEAN countries have recently said that they would also be a pole in this multipolar world. And the smaller states then can actually defy US and the collective West pressure. And you can see this from, I'll give 3 examples: Venezuela, Niger, and Cambodia, from the 3 global South continents. They have defied US orders, besides the larger countries who are doing it wantonly. Now, BRICS, of course, has also been resorting to significant steps like trading in national currency. They've developed a new development bank and a contingency reserve arrangement. Again, they keep emphasizing, especially not the Russia-China part of BRICS, but the others, that this is not an alternative to the dollar. They're not against the West, but this helps these countries to hedge their own, because of their own experience of unilateral economic measures and sanctions. By the way, the US has just last week threatened to sanction India. And I can go into it later as to why. Now, post the Ukraine and Israel, the genocide and conflict, Russia and China are now in the process of becoming extremely powerful Eurasian force. So they are a force, regional force in Asia. And the BRICS, other BRICS countries and the global South, they do not see Russia as a threat. It was not a colonizing power. And with China, even though some of them have had issues, including India and Vietnam, they want to engage and negotiate with China. And they don't want the US to intervene on their behalf. Of course, within this, there are also crevices in this system, the non-state actors and insurgencies who use these bickering powers, and the real threats from climate change, environmental damage, financial instability, and wars which impact the marginalized countries of the global South more than they do the rest. So for the global South, the UN and international law are protective shields. And within that, multipolarity for them, they believe, can lead to a more democratic and just international order. So I conclude by saying that a lawless international system, which is imposed because, there are countries which benefit from this so-called anarchy, the hypocrisy of different rules for different countries, the influence of the militarized financial systems and MICs over the will of people are the greatest threat because they're the ones who ignore the climate and environment done. And whereas a non-violent civil disobedience movement in alliance with democratic human rights, with international law, and states that abide by the UN is the greatest panacea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right on time there. Thank you very much, Anu. I hope people found that helpful. Michael Clare, you are on.
What a task. This is such an interesting conversation, and I'm so delighted to follow Richard and Anu because they have such rich tapestries of analysis. So we'll have to see how mine fits in. And then I look forward to how we respond to each other and to questions we get. So looking at these tectonic changes, I think the biggest tectonic change of recent time, maybe a little bit in contrast to what Richard says, is the continuing relative, and 3 underscores under that, the continuing relative decline of US net power compared to its principal rivals, especially China and Russia, and to the global South, broadly speaking. There's plenty of evidence to show that the USA's net power, economic, military, and diplomatic, has declined compared to the combination of all those other forces in the world. When you look back over time to where US power stood at the peak of the Cold War and in the post-Cold War era. This decline, I believe, has diminished Washington's ability to manage or dictate world affairs. We see this in its inability to rally global support behind Ukraine and now Israel, certainly to the extent that US leaders would like. And this has led to a lot of cheering in parts of the world, in the global left, among leaders of the global South, in China and Russia and elsewhere. But I think it would be a terrible mistake, analytically speaking, that is, to exaggerate the degree of US decline or to celebrate this decline prematurely. To begin with, a decline in US power with respect to China, India, and the global South is to be expected, given that the share of world population and world economy held by the US and its close allies has been shrinking for decades. And Anu spoke to that about the shift of net purchasing power and so on to the global South. But the fact that the US share of its US share of the global pie, if you will, is shrinking does not mean that the US is getting less powerful, as Richard pointed out, only that its net power compared to the rest of the world is in decline. China's rise, of course, is hardly surprising, given its size, its large population, its entrepreneurial spirit, its determined leadership. And one could say the same about India. And Russia, let us not forget, remains the world's #1 combined oil and natural gas superpower, and its #2 top producer of weapons, including nuclear weapons. In the global South, with its growing numbers, vast resources, its entrepreneurial energy is also growing, gaining more power in world affairs. But none of this means that the US is in decline, only that it is losing ground in a crowded field of challengers. More to the point, the US is still more powerful than any of its rivals or any combination of its rivals, and will remain so for the indefinite future, despite the efforts of China, Russia, and the global South, the BRIC countries, to diminish the role of the dollar in world economy. It's still the dominant currency, and I think will remain so for as far as we could see. More importantly, US technology has leaped ahead in many fields: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, autonomy, hypersonic weapons, and I see no reason to believe that there'll be any slowdown in US advantages and these technologies. And the Biden administration, following on the Trump administration, is doing everything it can to deny the ability of China and the other countries to catch up with US in these areas. US military spending is 3 times that of China, 10 times that of Russia, and US spending on research development alone is equal to the entire Chinese defense budget and is greater than the defense spending of any other country in the world. So the US is investing in future military technologies to assure that it'll have dominance for decades to come. America's challengers, while growing in combined strength, are not united in opposition to the United States. There's no anti-US coalition equivalent to NATO or AUKUS or the US-Japan relationship or any of the other US military ties. The recent meeting between China and Russia had a lot of showmanship in it, but there's no evidence that China is going to supply Russia with the lethal arms that it needs to prevail in Ukraine. And there's no Article 5, as there is in the NATO treaty, obliging either of them to come to their defense, each other's defense, in a war with the United States. So for me, the greatest geopolitical factor of the current era is going to be the power struggle, the ever-changing relative power struggle between these poles for power and influence around the world. And that's going to engulf the entire planet, including the global South, as these countries jockey for advantage, for allies, for influence, for spheres of influence. And this jockeying for the spheres of influence is going to be largely carried out in military terms, through arms transfers, through sending mercenaries and military advisors, providing weapons and intelligence, and direct and indirect military intervention, as we're seeing in Ukraine and in the Balkans and all throughout Africa, with Russia's primary role in Africa is to supply arms, mercenaries, and military intelligence. There's nothing benign about it whatsoever. And China is behaving pretty much in the same way, bribing high officials to gain contracts to benefit Chinese companies, providing weapons. None of this to the benefit of the African masses. All of this is a inter-imperial competition that, to me, looks a lot like the period before World War I. And in this environment, there can be no cooperation on climate change or any of the other issues that Joseph asked about.
Michael, I hate to do this, but I'm doing it again.
Yeah, no, I was coming to the end. I was just laying out what I see as a dangerous era, maybe like what Kromsky was saying, but a competitive struggle for power, not a democratic, fair-minded international order, but a competitive one with many flashpoints that could spark a larger conflict at any time. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. That was a very rich opening here. In moving toward our second question, I found myself thinking of something that Bob Moses, the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee many years ago, said in response to a question, who is we? And that grows from my question here. Given what each of you have spelled out, maybe Anu's being more hopeful than Michael and Richard, but nonetheless challenging. The question is, what then must be done? And recognizing that our audience is primarily from the United States, but not limited to the United States. Maybe to think in terms of what you think is most important, the most important responses for people who are committed to justice and peace to deal with this both painful and challenging era. And if you don't mind, maybe we'll go in the same order that you spoke, beginning with Richard.
Yes, that's a daunting question. What must be done? And I think different things should be done by the main geopolitical rivals. And in the American case, I think it should begin with a more sober recognition that power is not a good investment if it's reduced to military capabilities. And the US, more than its competitors, has persisted in that colonial faith, which was to some extent vindicated, that history is made by the stronger side militarily. If you look at the wars since, at least since a couple decades after the Second World War, 1945, the major wars between the militarily superior West and countries in the global South have been won by the weaker side militarily. They've been won, and the U.S. Had this experience in a very vivid way in Vietnam, where it was totally in command militarily, but lost the war. And it keeps doing the same thing despite this historical trend away from military agency. And it does so because the private sector, the military-industrial complex, so-called, doesn't allow it to learn the lessons of the decline in military, the decline in the agency of military power. And in that sense, I differ a little bit from Michael's emphasis on U.S. decline. Yeah, I think U.S. is more motivated to exhaust its resources by doing everything possible to arrest this tendency toward decline. And it's doing it with the mistaken ideas that are bordering on the absurd, that it's leading an alliance of democracies against autocracies, which is empirically a bad joke, and that its investment in the military gives it a effective claim to exercise dominance over the management of global security and to keep international law and the UN at the margins, the rhetorical margins of international life. So I think that, and maybe it's a provincialism on my part being American, that the what is to be done answer is primarily trying to revolutionize the participation of the US in the 21st century, both for the climate change, energy agenda, and for the security agenda. And to stop the practice of double standards, of saying that we can maintain our spheres of influence in Latin America, but Russia can't do anything in Ukraine without committing a wider war of between these geopolitical actors. And one final point, that this mistaken view that military power is the secret to real power in the 21st century is the non-receptivity to diplomacy and political compromise and stopping a ceasefire, trying to achieve ceasefire. Biden, more than Putin, has negated a diplomatic off-ramp in Ukraine, and of course has greenlighted this genocidal onslaught in Gaza. And it's a pronounced ideological spillover from this sense that the US is on the right side of history, whereas in actuality it's on the wrong side.
Richard, I've got to jump in. Thank you for that. Challenging. As you were talking, I was thinking about a webinar I was on yesterday in terms of the US-led Kenyan troops going into Haiti and an expectation that we're going to see the repeat of history there in a terrible way. Anu, you're next from a different perspective here.
Yeah, I think everyone recognizes that the US is, the only superpower, and everyone else is far behind militarily, financially, and even this whole drive towards trading in their own currencies and maybe developing a unit of transaction. This will, the dollar hegemony is recognized, and no one in the global south at least wants to challenge it. The only thing they want is they don't want to be dictated to about their choices in international relations or foreign policy, and they don't want intervention in their domestic affairs. Sometimes they're very wrong and they're violators of human rights, including my own government. But that is something between them and their own domestic constituencies, and they don't want the US to use that sometimes for one faction vis-a-vis another. They want to engage with the US in positive ways. So and I just give you one example. For example, the US in recent months has been trying to tell 3 countries in Asia, India, Vietnam, and Indonesia, to collaborate with them against China. Now, India and Vietnam have had bad experiences with China. They don't trust them fully. There are unresolved issues, border conflicts. But all three have said that we will negotiate with China on our own terms. We have our own relationship, going good or bad, but we don't want the US to be a mediator. India recently signed a 10-year agreement with Iran, which the US sees as an evil empire. India is going to manage the Chabahar port, giving millions of dollars and developing this north-south transport corridor from Mumbai through Iran till St. Petersburg. Now, the US has said they would sanction India for that, but they said, we don't care, but we have to have our own strategic autonomy. The US offered India some kind of partnership, favored partnership with some NATO groups. And the foreign minister of India said, we don't have a NATO mentality. So this is what is happening, that despite the US's strength, very weak countries comparatively, whether it's India, Vietnam, or South Africa, they are challenging the US on issues of how US power affects them. They're not challenging US power as a whole, but they have come to understand that whatever US does is in its own narrow national interest. It's not for democracy. It's not for liberal values. It's not for human rights. And we can see the double standards on that. And the governments are recognizing this, and the people even more, even when very often our own, in the global south, our governments don't represent people. And you can see that in West Asia, how the governments are actually oppressing their people. Otherwise, there'd be a bigger upsurge on the issue of Palestine. But they're being kept under control. But they all, none of them want to really defer to the US. And it's a good thing that a recent RAND study has recognized this, where they say that the US is the greatest power, but they've lost control over the kind of leverage they could have over the global south. And the global south does not want to follow them on a large number of issues, even though the global elite still wants to send their children to the US to study. We love US, American culture, music, books, American liberalism, and wish we had more of it, and their, freedom of expression. But nobody wants the US military in their countries anymore. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you. So, Michael, the challenge is to you.
Well, thank you, everybody, for your thoughts. We'll be feeding on them for a long time to come. Where I want to differ a little bit, just in tone with Richard and Anu, even though I agree with most of what they say, is your conversations were kind of US dominated. And in some ways, I think that's appropriate. But if we agree with Richard that we're in a world where military force is the currency of power transactions, has become the currency of international affairs. And that, I think, is the tragedy of our time. So, if you start from there, we're talking about a tripolar world of three heavily armed powers with the capacity to extend their military power beyond their borders in significant ways, and have nuclear weapons, and are on the verge of expanding their nuclear capabilities, and share multiple flashpoints. In my mind, this is the dominant reality of our moment, is this militarized world with three giant powers, heavily armed, with interests beyond their borders, and an inclination to intervene in the affairs of other countries in competitive ways. Now, having said that sentence, this looks to me a lot like the period of the first 14 years of the 20th century, when you similarly had three poles of power and mutual military competition extending beyond their borders around the world, intervening militarily with militarized elites in all of these poles, Russia, Germany, and Britain, and leading in the end to a world war that was catastrophic in its consequences. So, what is to be done? The first thing, Joseph, is for everybody should read, if they haven't already, Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers: How Europe Went to War in 1914, because I think that's the best book to describe where we are today. And I think when you read that and appreciate how we're in a similar moment of three heavily armed competitive powers intervening in the affairs of the rest of the world, that tells us what we have to do to begin thinking about preventive measures to prevent those skirmishes. Incidents, they were called skirmishes, incidents in the Balkans, in North Africa, in the Middle East, that occurred before World War One. Those are happening now. How to prevent them from triggering a massive global nuclear catastrophe? So, and there are things we should be thinking about. We have to get the three powers to sit down and agree. They're not going to agree to disarmament. They're not going to agree to sweeping agreements, but they have to agree to rules of the road, like keeping their ships apart in the South China Sea and the East China Sea.
Michael, we need to wrap up.
I'll wrap up. So, I mean, our task is to devise methods and promote methods for averting clashes with the capacity to trigger catastrophe.
Thank you, Michael. I found myself thinking about a number of the similarities to the period before World War I. Among them, the territorial competition, the complex alliance structures, the arms races with new technologies, the economic complications of it, and wild card actors, not the least of them being Donald Trump.
That war could have been prevented, in retrospect.
Only where I wanted to go with this. Yeah, we'll let it go and I'll wait till it comes back again. So we've got about 10 minutes or so for you to ask questions of one another. If you'll raise your hand physically, I can see it and give you the floor. Richard.
Yes, let me put a question to Michael, because I think his tripolar image is misleading. To me, the asymmetric character of the U.S. is expressed in terms of military investment and ideological fervor, that the other two don't. They both have them, but to a much lesser degree. In other words, the lack of symmetry between these three actors it seems to me, gives priority to the what is to be done part, focusing on the U.S. China seems quite prepared to work toward a more peaceful collaboration between the geopolitical actors. And even Putin, if you read what he said over the years, he wanted a common security framework that included Europe. The US and NATO have not wanted that. They've wanted a continuation of the privileged, exploitative domination of the non-Western world. And they're prepared to overlook genocide. They're prepared to sacrifice the Ukrainian people in order to realize that kind of unipolar world order.
Michael?
Well, so, you know, this is an interesting discussion in which we, you know, we probably both agree more than not, but I do disagree. The difference is purely territorial and capacity. That is to say, the US views itself as a global power. Russia and China at this stage have regional, primarily regional, but wide-ranging ambitions. And when it comes to the areas that they consider within their sphere of influence, they are prepared to deploy forces on a very large scale and in a very threatening scale. So in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, China has been very militarily aggressive and poses, it behaves in a way, now, the US behaves worse. So I could talk about that at length, but China also behaves in an aggressive, militarily aggressive and threatening manner in what it considers its sphere of influence. And it's building up its military capacity to do so in an even stronger way, to intimidate the ASEAN countries and Taiwan and so on. And Russia is preparing to do so and building up now the capacity to intimidate countries on its borders to the west and to the south. And as I say, is using military means to gain influence very successfully in Africa in an anti-democratic, anti-humane, anti-human rights fashion. So they may not have the power, the equivalent power of the US, but they are certainly behaving in similarly aggressive ways in areas that they find an interest in. So in my mind, there is still a danger. The danger lies in the capacity, the possibility, the potential for clashes between these great powers in these contested areas. And there are a ring of contested areas that stretches from the Arctic in Scandinavia to the Baltic Sea, to the Black Sea, to the Middle East, to Southeast Asia, and back to the Arctic. And within that ring, the scale of aggressiveness is more or less equal on the different sides.
Anu, do you want to jump in on this? You're muted.
Again, to Michael, see, I don't think any in these three polls, I don't think the two other polls outside the US really want to have any kind of military confrontation with the US actually, unless they know they cannot have any kind of military confrontation with them. And they can only remain a regional powers. And I do agree that to some extent, China especially can be quite aggressive in the South China Sea, but they also pull back when ASEAN, for example, has come together and push them, and they're also engaging with ASEAN as ASEAN is with China, and trying to have rules building rules of how maritime rules, etc., so that there would be some ways in which there could be an agreement on how to behave in the South China and East China Sea. The one country being an exception is the Philippines and, of course, South Korea. So I think there are possibilities if the US would look at it in a broader way, that if they engage with these countries, even if they don't want to engage with Russia, they engage with the countries of the global South and try to understand what they are saying. Why is it that they don't feel a threat from either Russia or China in the same way? They do not want a military. You said that the global South doesn't have an equivalent military alliance. The fact is they don't want to have a military alliance with each other or with the West. They don't want to be part of NATO. In fact, they see the expansion of NATO into the Indo-Pacific or into the Arctic. You're signing these defense cooperation agreements now with Sweden and Finland, so 17 new bases in Sweden. So the militarization of the Arctic, I think most countries in the global South see this as a very dangerous trend. So there's a desperate need for global disarmament. And that's the only way, and that can only come if that threat inflation decreases. This threat of countries is getting exaggerated because they're not talking to each other. India and China have had, physical wars and conflagrations, but they've had about 24 commander level talks over the past. So they keep talking also. So I think that kind of engagement, which was there during the Gorbachev, that period of which was a wonderful period for global disarmament, should actually come back.
So I'm going to jump in here. Thank you, but I think we need to kind of turn to participants' questions. I'm seeing a combination of questions and too many comments in the Q&A button there. So just to repeat, if you could hold off with your comments, but if you have a question for the speakers, that would be good. But as we jump in, I just want to focus for a moment on the dangers of the flashpoints. It's interesting. I was in a conversation last week with, among others, a retired Russian general who, we all know about Colonel Peskov, who was the man who saved the world by saying that what the computers were showing for a missile attack on Russia was false. But in fact, I learned that the computerized message went all the way to Andropov and his what they call the suitcase, the equivalent of the nuclear football. So I think we have to appreciate the possibility that the confrontations in South China Sea, Ukraine, elsewhere, we have the Russians now with their tactical nuclear weapons test, but also the threats of NATO intervening in Ukraine and more directly, all of which can tip off those flashpoints into, I hate to say it, the end of essentially the end of human life. So to my mind, it talks about the absolute importance of finding ways to press for common security diplomacy, even if that's not all that we want. I mean, I'll just add here to say that I think both Russia and China are seeking, if you will, a degree of regional hegemony, while the U.S. is attempting to maintain its global hegemony, and therein I think lies the sharpest of the tensions there. So let me go to the questions here. One was how many people were on or have been online, and that number was 140. And I look forward to seeing the registration list and seeing where we all come from. We had more who registered, some of whom wrote before saying they had a conflict, but they want the they want the recording. So on that goes. So here's a question from Mark Ginsburg. how does the militarization of outer space figure in here? This may be a Michael question, I'm not sure.
Well, I could answer it, but you know, it fits the pattern of all of this that I'm saying is this heated, but it fits with what Richard was saying as well, that you have an intensified competition for dominance of the global of the global competitive space and writ large, and that's terrestrial space where it's competitive, like the oceans. Now the Arctic is very competitive. I could talk about that. And space has become a competitive arena among the great powers. And the bottom line is that the U.S. uses space for an advantage in combat to provide its forces with information on not to directly attack the ground, but to provide its ground and sea forces with precise information on where to attack enemy forces. And so this is a liability for China and Russia, both of which have been developing and testing weapons to deny that ability to the US. And this has led the US to now think of counter anti-space weapons. And so we're seeing the beginning of an arms race in space. But all this goes back to what we've been talking about.
Thank you, Michael. Then we've got a question for all three of you, or each of you. How do you view the role of the United Nations in a number of scenarios? What role can the United Nations play positively, and where might it be playing some negative roles? Maybe begin with Anu, and then Richard, then Michael. You're muted.
Yeah, Richard has written a lot on the role of the United Nations and international law, and I generally go by, by his reading. But the United Nations ultimately is a forum of states, and if you see that in the UN General Assembly and the Security Council, let's say on Israel and Palestine, for example, the bulk of the countries have been supporting a negotiated settlement, a two-state solution, and they have passed resolution after resolution. But in the Security Council, the United States has vetoed 41 times of the total 83 vetoes that they have done. 41 have been on the issue of Israel and protecting Israel alone. So they've actually stood in the way of a negotiated settlement all these years. Whereas the entire global South, even, a lot of global South countries have very good relations with Israel, but nonetheless, they have been, it's a moral question, and the legacy issue of those who are complicit in violating UN resolutions, whether it's Russia at some point, or China, or India, or the US. They've all been violators at some point. And it stays on them. It's a moral shame that they do. They're going against the will. They're often against, actually human rights issues and democracy issues. So I think the only way to circumvent the threats which Michael was talking about, this tripolar. And again, I also agree with what Richard said, that there is a deep asymmetry of power, but nonetheless, all these powers, including other nuclear powers, have the ability to destroy the entire region, if not the world. So there really needs to be some goals. And I think there's also a comment that what can ordinary people do? I think ordinary people have to do exactly what they're doing now in the US, like what the students are doing or the trade unions are doing. They have to push for common security. They have to push for negotiations. And they have to push for internal democracies in all their countries, because that is where ultimately the push for a better international system also comes from. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for focusing on what ordinary people can do. Richard, you're the expert here.
Well, I agree very much with what Anu just said. I would only add that the UN from the very beginning was designed to be weak when it comes to the management of global power. Otherwise, it made no sense to give the right of veto to the five most dangerous countries in the world. And one of the delegates said, the UN was an organization created to hold the mice accountable while the tigers run free. And in many ways, it has adapted to that core limitation when it comes to war prevention. War prevention is left to the strategic prudence of these 5 states, in particular the 3 that we've been focusing on. And that's not a very encouraging system. One should also recognize, though, that the UN is more than the Security Council and General Assembly. It does a lot of positive things in its various smaller agencies, from the Council on Human Rights to refugees to culture, lots of things, and that's very important. It's also important in establishing what is legitimate and what is illegitimate in world affairs. The harm to Israel's global reputation is in part a result of what Anu was saying, that it's protected in its criminality by the US, but it hasn't fooled the peoples of the world. The peoples of the world, including of the countries that are supporting Israel, by and large, see what these horrifying realities and this transparency of the genocide make evident on the level of human perception, even if it's ignored by the sophisticated foreign policy elites that are shaping the policy that is being pursued. So we have to work to strengthen the UN by exerting enough people power that it will finally be able to act effectively in relation to what its basic promise was in the preamble to the UN Charter, that of being a war prevention organ that saves succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It was not given the capabilities or really the authority to carry out that primary mandate.
Thank you, Richard. I wish it were otherwise, but it is what it is. Michael?
No, it's hard to follow the eloquence of Richard Falk on a matter like this. I take my hat off to you, Richard, for your thoughtfulness on this topic. Well, let me say this. I do have some thoughts about the UN. If you take what I started from, which is that the aggressive or the assertive geopolitical competition between the 3 major powers for influence in these contested areas, flashpoint areas, could lead to a nuclear conflict. In my mind, that's the greatest danger we face in the world today, along with climate change. and it's pushing climate change off the boards of diplomacy. So it is now the dominant threat in the world. So can the UN play a role? Yes, it can, I think, in these circumstances, because as I said, we need rules to prevent unintended consequences from escalating, and the introduction of weapons that will, like in space, that will increase the likelihood of unintended escalation. And the UN is actually playing, I think, a very positive role in this arena by holding what they call groups of governmental experts on space warfare, on artificial intelligence, now on autonomous weapons systems. UN General Assembly is going to conduct a debate on that subject in the fall, which I think will be very important conversation that could lead to an international treaty banning the deployment of fully autonomous weapons systems, which I think would contribute to the dangers in the planet. So the UN can play a role, an important role, in trying to, it can't solve these geopolitical tensions, but it could play a very useful role in trying to mitigate the risks that they will explode in a thermonuclear catastrophe.
Thank you, Michael. I'm looking at the clock and I'm not happy with where we are. We got a lot of questions and I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them.
Don't have three people questions.
Well, I see what I've got here. So here's one of the questions we have is Russia and China saw Iran as as an important pole in West Asia to expand a multipolar world order. How do you calculate or see Iran as a strong pole, especially after the demise of Ibrahim Raisi? Who wants to take on what's happening with Iran? I'm going to ask maybe Richard if you can pick that one up.
Okay, I'll be glad to. I mean, the first easy part is I don't think the death of Raisi has much bearing at all on the role of Iran. He was not a particularly influential president. In Iran, the supreme guide is Khamenei, who presided over the key policy choices of Iran. I think Iran has shown a surprising resilience in the face of hostility from Saudi Arabia, the US, Israel. It somehow managed to create a sufficient defensive capabilities and a certain level of prudence that has enabled it to survive where many other countries of similar character would have in some way succumbed either to internally dominated movements, which it's had many that have threatened the so-called Islamic Revolution of 1979. And I think that it has also the possibility of moving toward a more pragmatic approach to its relations in the region. It's been open to relations even with Saudi Arabia, overcoming the so-called sectarian division between Shia and Sunni Islam, and it has been willing to negotiate with pretty much any power that would negotiate with it. Trump repudiated the nuclear agreement that had kept the issue of nuclear weapons under pretty reliable control. So that my guess is that Iran may become a flashpoint in the sense that we've been discussing, and that danger shouldn't be ruled out. I think Israel has, in the course of its failures in Gaza, had the thought at one point of a wider war, which would draw the U.S. into the region in a direct way. And its attack on Damascus on April 1st, I think, was a exploratory probe in that direction, which fortunately neither Washington nor Iran responded in the way that Netanyahu may have wanted. He was a cornered hero, and still, a cornered ex-hero, and as John F. Kennedy warned in his 1963 speech in the nuclear age, you don't want to have to deal with leaders that either are faced with political surrender or a war that may cross the nuclear threshold. So one should worry about Iran, but at the same time realize that it's a reasonably responsible actor, at least internationally and regionally.
So I'm going to jump in here and say, well, I guess there's a question here. Who's responsible for taking out the Nord Stream pipeline? What do you think? Who wants to jump on that one? Go ahead, Anu. I see you took your.
Yeah, I think I'd go by what Seymour Hersh and other major journalists have, they've done their independent investigation. And it seems clear, who did it benefit? And the fact that Biden actually said it. Now, whether the US did it or not, the point is their fingers do point in that direction. But beyond that, we don't know. It's gone much beyond that now, the war. And even without having bombed that pipeline, the gas flows from Russia to the West were, in any case, decreasing, declining, and stopping. And Russia now really is not looking to the West as a buyer. They would have closed it themselves. They have plenty of buyers in the rest of the global majority, as they call it.
So I'm seeing here a question about how to build international networks of peace movements, and simply to say that a number of them already exist. And one of the questions is simply how you can link up with it. As I mentioned as we began, we have a working group at this point comprised of people across Asia Pacific and here in the US to develop a resource on how to move forward, what's needed in terms of common security. I'd encourage people to look at the webpage of the International Peace Bureau, which is one of our co-sponsoring organizations, but that's really its role in the world. And there are a number of other networks, Abolition 2000, a whole range of them. And I'd be happy to correspond with people about what they are and how you can engage. I'm also thinking that, we are a panel here of even those of us who don't have much hair left. We're a white-haired group, and scholars. And the question about what could be done at the grassroots level. Happy for your input on this, but I'm also thinking that the next webinar needs to bring forward more youthful voices in terms of how we build our movements, how they see priorities. I think we've got time for. Well, actually, we don't have a whole lot of time. What I want to do is I want to give each of you 2 minutes to kind of frame just closing remarks, what you want people to take away from this session. We can do this in any order that you like. I just sprang that question on you. So raise your hand when you're ready to go, or otherwise my fickle finger here will point in your direction. So let's begin with Anu, who didn't do the first speaking. Let's go with Anu, Michael, and give Richard the last word.
I think I've already summed it up when I said what I see as a panacea, and that is I believe in international law, and even if because we adhere to international law and common rules, even if we get defeated for a long time, like let's say the Indian nationalist movement in the 40s or Palestinians today, or the Jews during the Second World War. I mean, look at what Holocaust and its memory and shame did to the Germans ultimately. And I think what happened to the colonial powers with much weaker, against much weaker non-militarized powers. Ultimately, I think that is the will that prevails, even though they suffer and generations are lost. But I think we should still have faith in the United Nations and international law. I don't see any alternative to that.
Michael?
And common security.
Michael.
So first, let me just thank you, Joseph, and Mariana Fernandez, our tech person on this Zoom call, and Joseph for putting all of this together, and my co-panelists, because to me it's been utterly fascinating and informative to hear these other views. And I preface this to my remarks to say, first of all, it's absolutely essential that we have these kind of conversations, because I think decoding and understanding what's happening at a time of such profound changes is a terribly important and difficult task. We are learning from each other here because these developments are hard to measure, but they're critical. So conversations like this are terribly important. And I can assure you, for the best of my knowledge, they're not happening in the capitals of the powers we're talking about. The senior leadership and the so-called foreign policy intellectuals, for the most part, are not having conversations like this, reasoned and analytically based conversations about the state of the world. So it's really important that we have conversations like this, and it helps us shape what kind of peace movements and what the peace movement should be focusing on. And we each have our, this might have our preferences. I believe in the importance now of galvanizing what we had during the Cold War period, which was an anti-bomb, anti-nuclear movement. But I think we all agree on the need for these kinds of movements. So thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Mariana, and Richard, and Anu.
Richard, the last word.
Well, it's a pleasure and a challenge to follow Michael, and he made a very gracious description of the value of this sort of conversation. I agree totally with what he said. I would only add that the media is also not very receptive to, especially the influential international media platforms, really reinforce regressive ways of thinking about the situation that the world is facing at this point, and certainly cut out peace-oriented and more law and UN-oriented perspectives on how to cope with this period of profound change and equally profound transition from one set of relationships to another. And it's quite shocking that even in so-called free societies, one has such a level of foreclosed debate that one really doesn't hear voices that are giving alternatives to military overinvestment, to the approach to global policy through cooperative urgency. It probably one of the most important things that can be done at this point is to give much more attention to the common problems that humanity faces, and correspondingly try to resolve by political peace-minded diplomacy the conflictual area. And that's one reason I fault so much the American approach to the world at this stage, because it seems to do its best to eliminate compromise and some sort of recognition that other points of view deserve respect and accommodation, and is still, I feel, trapped in this search for a stable paradigm of dominance when it comes to the management of global power. And that's a dead end in my view.
Well, I want to thank each of the three of you for moving us into some profound areas that I hope those who've participated here, our audience, will be able to build on. And there's an obvious need for continuing discussion. I'm going to take a last word or two quite before we go. Simply kind of building on what Richard was just saying. The reality here in the United States, as we see with the police repression and universities president's repression of nonviolent free speech and acting in solidarity to end the Israeli genocide, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry is even under greater threat here in the United States than it's been in the past. And not only are extreme Zionists pushing this, but also right-wing political forces in alliance with them. So, if we're going to make progress, we have to have the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. Just to say, tomorrow, when Harvard University has its graduation, there will be protesters in Harvard Square basically saying, let them graduate, stop the killing, and let's have a negotiated ceasefire and movement toward peace. I want to call people's attention to two other webinars that Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security will either be co-sponsoring or leading. One will be on May the 29th, which will be a webinar with Annie Jacobson, who has written the book Nuclear War, a Scenario. She's actually, if you will, gone deeply into thinking through and describing the unthinkable, how it would unfold and what the consequences would be. It's chilling, but it's where we live, and it's what those flashpoints that we were mentioning threaten. And then finally, we'll be doing on the 30th an introduction to U.S.-China relations, looking at its history and some of the more positive ways forward. So we'll send you the links to that, those of you who are on here. And I guess the last thing just to say, I'm missing Noam Chomsky. Would that he could be with us. And a couple of years ago, we we taped something with Noam in which he, after describing, the horrors that we face, said, we have solutions to the existential threats. We know what to do in relationship to nuclear weapons, get rid of them, in relationship to the threat of the ongoing threat of the climate emergency, the need to change policies and to be acting in a way more consistent with environmental sustainability. What he said was, we know the solutions. The question is if we have the will. And so I want to challenge, our speakers here certainly have expressed and demonstrated the will over many years. But I want to encourage those who have joined us here to dig deep and to think in terms of both pulling forward the will and the imagination to move us forward. So with that, I want to thank again our speakers. I want to thank Mariana and wish everybody to do the best as you move forward to affirm life in its most fundamental ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Nice to be with you.